So graphic design research is kind of a difficult thing to pinpoint. It's for several reasons. One, graphic design itself is difficult to define. So I'm going to go with the definition by Juliet Cesar for the AIGA. And that basically is summed up to it's visual communication where we use both textual and visual content. So kind of like images and type generally falls into graphic design. And the reason that graphic design is so difficult to pinpoint down, especially today, is that we have so many things that are falling under the scope of a graphic designer that maybe never did before. A lot of content creation is done by graphic designers now, and graphic designers are starting to code, they're starting to use things that may not even be visual, they're working with soundscapes or various different ways of communicating something that might not be what is traditionally thought of graphic design, which is creating artifacts that are printed. Obviously the web and social media has changed that a lot. Research itself, just as a term, is really difficult to pinpoint as well, because it's a term that we take from science, essentially, and that we're trying to apply to design. And there has been some criticism of graphic design for trying to scientize the term in order to give us more credibility. And it is helpful to have something that we can fall back on to give us credibility. But what ends up happening is that the definition of research for the sciences does not neatly fit onto what we do as designers, which is really an important thing for us to have a lot of background information, because we are doing things that are very effective in our community, getting somebody to buy something, or getting a message across, or getting someone to vote. All of those things that are being done by graphic designers, they need to have facts behind them. Although sometimes facts don't seem really huge in the scope of politics or something like that right now. What is kind of exciting is that research is something that's much more global now. Research is something that everyone has access to through a phone or a laptop or going to a library or a tablet. So it's exciting because we have things like Wikipedia, which can be the bane of a lot of teachers. They don't like that people just go to Wikipedia, but when you scroll down to the bottom of the page, you have all those wonderful resources, and it's teaching people things like how to cite and how to verify your sources. And it causes discussion in the pages on Wikipedia, which is really, I think, exciting, because a lot of times people didn't know proper citation, or weren't having conversations about where their information was coming from, or weren't figuring out if their source was, a peer-reviewed source. So those are all exciting things, and it's becoming much more active in the public. So when it comes to the theory of design research, there's a lot of discussion about what constitutes the research, and also how it's applied to design. The theory is not necessarily the most exciting part, but it's the part that we need to figure out before we can apply it. So I'm getting a Master's of Fine Arts, which is a practical degree. And so there's a difference. It's a terminal degree, but there's a difference between doing something like that and a PhD or another higher education degree that is not practical. So what happens sometimes is we talk about theory abstractly, but we're not necessarily talking about how it applies to education or to our practice. And so I felt like I had an opportunity as a candidate for an MFA to try to reach over into that theory and then bring it into the practical application where the rubber hits the road and teaching students. And some of the reasons that I was really interested in that is that I found as I was teaching, I had been teaching for 6 years at Virginia State University. And one of the courses that I had been teaching is the portfolio course, which is one of the capstone courses that the students have to take when they graduate. And I was finding that a lot of my students had gone through college and had not really gotten a very good, firm grasp of research, or even that they needed to do research. They were very focused on the practical application of the type and the image and putting things together. The other thing is that I really wanted to verify my own knowledge, because we have a very strong mythology in graphic design about why we do what we do and how it affects our work. So for example, type is always something that can be really argued over. When do you use a serif versus a sans serif typeface or something like that? And I realized that I couldn't verify my knowledge with something that says, yes, this makes it easier to read, or this makes this more legible. So I wanted to be able to do that for my students and also for my practice. So Nigel Cross is a voice in design research from the UK. And he was one of the first to talk about the taxonomy of design research from the point of view of dissecting it in order to better apply it. And a lot of our design research comes from architecture, because they already have a lot of scientific background, because they have to use physics and they're engineers. So they bring a tradition from the sciences into their design practice. And so we have borrowed that as graphic designers a lot. Excuse me. So one of the things he talks about is designerly ways of knowing. So there is a sort of tacit knowledge that is sort of assumed by designers, that we understand things, that there's some type of internal impetus. There's also the study of practice and process of design. So we may be researching and studying how those things are physically done, whether it's setting type, or we can look at the history of typography and see how certain things that we have now, like a serif, or the way a certain ligature works, comes from things like typesetting and even chiseled typography. And then the study of the form and configuration of artifacts. So the artifacts are something like, let's say, packaging from the 19th century or something of that nature. And so we see why things evolved the way they did, and that research into the development of those things will help us understand how they work the way they do. Meredith Davis is a really well-known American speaker on the design research subject. She's done a lot of speaking and conferences through the AIGA, which is the Professional Association for Design. And she is really active in looking into the development of criteria for PhD programs, and heavy on the theory and education part of graphic design research. And she talks about design research as being the act of discovering, and then as the knowledge developed through practice, and then specific knowledge, context-specific knowledge. So, for example, if you have knowledge of a project or a process or a client, those things that you bring to design as design works well for this in this situation. So, for example, the best way to design, say, a website for somebody who is visually impaired. Something like that. Those are very specific context situations. So, at one point, Christopher Frayland said that you research either into art, research through art, or research for art. So that would be something like you look into the project, you see like how something is going to work for a particular client, or you're going to actually do it through the process of designing. That would be part of your research through art and design. And then research for it would be doing backup work, looking to find particular cases that work for that particular client or subject matter. And so, so he's looking at history, he's looking at materials and development, and he's looking at the accumulation of reference materials. So things like going through archives and working with research assistants or librarians to create a basis for that which you're going to be working on. And this actually brings up the big sort of debate in graphic design theory, and that is, it might not sound like a lot to someone outside, but it is amazing how much it is talked about, is whether or not the process of design itself is research. Ken Friedman, who I believe is from New Zealand, and he writes and speaks a lot about design research. He said that what Frayling did was he was proposing methodology, and that everybody looked back on it and said, oh, you can research through designing. And that's not what was initially intended. And he's also saying that a lot of our nomenclature is used incorrectly when we talk about design knowledge and tacit knowledge. And he also says that the educational texts that Frayling was referencing are misadaptations, and they don't really truly work from education to design. So, so I wanted to look at that and see what designers were thinking about graphic design research, how they were dealing with that in their practice and with their students. So I did a survey of graphic design instructors who are teaching at four-year schools and who were at schools that that were accredited. Excuse me. So one of the questions that I asked them through this survey, and I'm going to go back and forth between the survey and some of the other stuff so we don't just get stuck on the survey results, because that's not very exciting, and also it doesn't tell you much on its own. But one of the things I wanted to know about is, do people assume this? Are people looking at graphic design as something that is part of their research? How can we broaden that? Is that what's being taught to the students? And also, I wanted to know what they were calling these elements of graphic design research, because one of the huge problems is that we can't narrow down a term, and so it's really hard to get something to work if we can't talk about it, we don't have the language about it. So somebody says research, and then people are thinking all these different things. So I asked them, are graphic designers conducting research when they practice design, when they explore concepts through design, when they test design theory, when they research artifacts, when they employ research methodology, or do you just don't think that graphic designers perform research? And these were my answers. I had about 130 or so responses. I had sent out about 1,200 requests. Of course, when you send out requests, there's a lot of loss anyway, but I was fortunate to get responses from across the country and in all different types of situations. But what I also learned is that it's a little bit of a free-for-all when we're talking about what this research is, because 78 of those people said just whenever they practice design, that's considered research. So obviously I wanted to get a little deeper into that. And one of the ways I did that was through further questions in this survey, but also by doing one-on-one interviews with graphic designers who are instructors, who are at those four-year programs, and who also conduct research themselves and who are published. And that really opened up the perspective to all of these answers, because what I was learning was to get through the fluff and to really get to the idea of how do we instruct these students to actually get into the practice and bring that practice of research into their graphic design practice. So I asked these questions about your position on practice as a form of design research, which is that big question, like, do you feel like designing is research itself? And as you can see, 60% or so said that design practice is a method of research. 61% said that it's an exploratory form of research. Fairly large amount said that it tests design theory, and it's a subject of historic research, or it's completely separate from design research. And it was actually a pretty small amount who said design research is separate from design practice. So I was talking a little bit about our mythology in graphic design, and the interesting thing is that we have this belief that we are struck with inspiration. It's interesting because lots of times people say to me like, oh, I wish I were creative, or I wish that I could do these things, and I'm always saying that creativity, like anything else, is a skill. It just needs to be practiced to be learned. But there is a strong belief within the graphic design profession that there is this unexplainable impulse that we get, that just we know something is right, or we know something is going to work that way. And so a lot of times we are resistant to research because we want to hold on to that because it makes us feel special, sort of thing. We have this idea, and it's really, not only is it frightening to break free from that, but it's also kind of insulting to our design heroes who never had the need to explain themselves, but we know that they are, gods in our profession. So I asked in this survey about the application of design research, what falls under the term graphic design research. And I tried through a lot of trial and error before I actually did the survey to try to figure out what people were talking about when they said graphic design research. And I kind of broke it down into these sort of difficult to pinpoint, and a lot of these overlap kind of thing, but we wanted to see what what people were thinking about. And so I'm going to go through these individually. Artifact review is when we go and we look at things that are pieces of design history. And I found that this was fairly important from a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being the most important. This is how graphic designers who are professors in these 4-year programs feel it is for their own personal practice, and then how important is it for their graphic design instruction. And obviously, artifact research is kind of like art history. It's going to be pretty important because we have to know where we came from. Book periodical and printed matter review. So this can be either something very specific of artifact review, reviewing the books itself, or getting our knowledge from books, which it probably is a little bit more. So you're looking at graphic design books or books on typography and things of that matter. So that was also fairly important, and even more so for the students for their instruction. Database review can be important both for finding your sources, but also just reviewing a database also shows you where the conversation is about a subject by leading you through the different parts of it. We have some that are very specific to design, like ArtStore is largely about imagery, or we have something that is very generic, like Google Scholar, but it can be used to hone down your search. And for database review, we were really sort of in the middle. People were not as excited one way or the other about how important it was. Once again, I think that's also because it's falling away from the art part of design and more toward that science kind of feeling for research. Focus groups. A focus group can be people that are gathered together at the same time and reviewed, or they can be individually reviewed and then the information is taken as a group. And I found that these were not as important to designers, which is kind of interesting because a lot of designers are doing work that has to be evaluated through market research, which would be a focus group. So I thought that was kind of interesting that they didn't feel as important for design research. Historic document review would be looking, obviously, at historic documents. As we, designers, we frequently don't look at the content. We are looking at the design of a document, or maybe the printing method or something of that nature, or we're looking for the style of something maybe from a certain period in order to adapt that to what we're working on. And kind of fell in the mid-range, not as important to say as the artifact design. And again, on the top, that's personal practice, and on the bottom is for instruction. Image and visual reference review. Now this is something that I'm constantly going after my students about, especially my studio art students, not the graphic design students, is that you can't imagine what something looks like, you need to look at it. And so this is something that, for example, I just looked up Gothic art in the Google image search, so you may think you know what something looks like, but until you actually look at it, you don't really know. And then also, just getting things correct when you're looking at these images, and as well as finding something in order to purpose it for design. And that was really important, and I bet that has a lot to do with illustration and making sure you have good visual references, as well as getting good references for concept. Inquiry with research specialists. This is really one of the best kinds of research because you can speak with someone who can guide you somewhere. It's frequently, I know that my students will say like, oh, I Googled it, or I stuck it in a search engine, but you're getting so much feedback and so many results. It's not nearly the same as getting something that's very pointed. And obviously a research specialist can help you find very specific works. They can also help you find things that you don't necessarily know would be applicable to your subject matter. And yet, we're not really that excited about them in graphic design research. We kind of want in the middle of the road. We're like, okay, librarians, archivists. I don't think that we're necessarily always encouraging that with students. Interdisciplinary collaboration. This is one of the most exciting things about graphic design research right now, is that the possibilities through working through different areas within a university, especially a research university, can really help us improve our design overall, because we can work with people who are doing electronics or object design or all different types of things, and people who actually are doing a lot more scientific type of research, and then we can utilize those possibilities in our own work. And then we can help them with their aesthetics, because sometimes what we are excited about is just the visual, and then if somebody else has this information that's really important, but they're not visually explaining it well enough, they're not making it visually accessible toward a common person, only the person in that subject matter can get it, then we can help them with that. And that seems to be really important to our professors, and for their own practice as well as for their students. The thing that I found through doing the interviews is that these programs that are the most successful with putting together their programs of study and putting research into it largely are getting involved through interdisciplinary projects. Some of them are actually writing it into their curricula, and that's really helpful, because when you get out of school, you're not going to just be working with other designers. Sometimes you're not working with any other designers. You're working with various people in different departments, or you're working with marketing people, or you're working with clients that are very different than you are. And if you're able to explain to someone else, and also you're able to use the information that comes from other people, then you are able to succeed with that. The other thing that, through the interviews with these people at these universities who are very active in graphic design research, I found that the individuals were using a lot of social responsibility and real-life applications to design and getting their students to talk to people in the community or getting people involved in projects for very technical and applied versions of design, and that was really enabling them to pick up on this research because they had to research the subject matter in order to make these things viable. So interviews themselves are a really great way of doing research. For me, it was the most enlightening for my project, but also it's really helpful to find out how to learn how to speak and ask someone questions so that you can get the information that you need. And that is not just for general research, but also just for something specific for a client. You need to be able to get down to the core of what they need. And while people were finding them important for their personal practice, it's not as important for them to get their students to be doing this at an undergraduate level. A lot of these things are coming up in graduate level courses. And so these aspects are, I think one of the most difficult things is just being able to apply them to the time that they have. You have so many things that you have to get in for a four-year degree that it's just difficult for that. Now, observation and visual exploration means very different things in the world of science versus the world of market research versus the artistic part of design. So doing observation could be just seeing what the overall situation is with something, where something's going to go. You need to look at, for example, if you have a very site-specific design, then you need to be able to see how it's going to work in that situation. Because designers generally have to have a fine art basis in order to show composition and things. Something like a life study course in drawing would be an observation and visual exploration. Observing groups and how they interact is something that falls more toward the social sciences, and then we have a lot of watching how people use things in order to design best for technology or for applications or for user experience. And these were all considered very important both for personal practice and for student instruction because, let's face it, all the design teachers want our students to sketch more, not just to be able to teach them to observe from nature, but also because it's through sketching that we can come up with designs and we get them to do it a lot. Peer-reviewed and scholarly journal review would be one of the first areas that I would expect my students to learn things, especially if they're going to be using any type of facts in their design work. And I was really surprised it wasn't something that was really being pushed by the professors for the students. It was, as you can see, a lot of them felt that it wasn't really that important for their students. I am of a different school for that, but once again, I think it is really dependent on how much time you have. And then search engine, blog, website, and video review. I kind of clumped these together because they were sort of a general feeling things out sort of way of exploring. And they found these moderately, important. And I also think it's just really the easiest way for students to get information, and professionals too. I know that when I'm at work and I need a reference for something that I'm working on, that's the first thing I'm going to do rather than take a necessarily trip to the library or something. Surveys and questionnaires. One thing that is very difficult about doing a survey and questionnaire, which I learned from this process, is that it's hard to get a really good sample that's reflective of all the factors that you need to consider. And we weren't really focused in one area or the other. And the other thing that I'm discovering as I'm doing more of the interviews is that a lot of people don't know how to correctly administer these. They don't know how to deal with the data. And so a lot of the questionnaires aren't really effective. And I know that as I've been receiving questionnaires and surveys, from students or professionals. Lots of times I'm like, oh, they asked that the wrong way. Like if they had said this could mean this and this, or you know, the way they're asking those questions, they're not going to be able to triangulate that kind of data to see like how to hone that information in. So it's been a great experience, but one thing that I have really learned through it is that it really pays to have somebody else help you with this who knows what they're doing, because it's not in a designer's mindset to do questionnaires. And then usability testing, we see this a lot. I know that lots of times if we're designing something, even if it's not for a user interface like something like the web, even if it's like, oh, do you get this in this brochure or something like that, we do that in a very weak sense. We show it to people who may already know the subject matter. You might just walk up to a family member or somebody on the street and ask them a question, and there really is so much more to it, and that's something that we're not really pulling into it as far as design research goes. And again, we weren't really, I was expecting this to be like one of the top ones, like usability testing being like, yeah, I want my students to do that and I do it myself. And it really wasn't the case. And as I was interviewing people, I was finding like, first of all, there's a time limit to projects, especially if you're on a quarter system rather than a semester system. And there's also just difficulty getting that sample size as well. And it takes a lot of knowledge about research in order to do it correctly, and that's not something we're necessarily prepared with. So I also wanted to know how design research is being taught, and I asked, what the undergraduate students were being taught and what were they expected to use. And I have to say that I didn't get a lot out of these questions, because I think it's very overwhelming to try to focus where you're getting these things in your curriculum. Unless you have built your curriculum around the concept of research, and these projects are going to teach these things, if we try to do it retroactively, it's very difficult to pinpoint those things and to figure out how they're being applied. And again, with difficulty with these questions is that this could be considered both observation and it could be a study group, or this could be, this is, I consider this research, but maybe it's not considered research as a whole, or the way I do it is research. And so these things are difficult when you're going forward and trying to have that conversation. And I asked how this was taught as opposed to just asking what these subjects are being taught, like how is it actually being applied in the curricula. And some teachers are teaching courses that are specifically about research. That I found a lot less of at the undergraduate level. More people at the graduate level are working on those types of things. It's part of a course that covers research, not quite as many. More are research assignments given through studio courses, which is what that practical application goes back to in Bachelor of Fine Arts and Master's of Fine Arts. We're doing a lot of practical applications, so we fit it into the coursework that way. I teach the graphic design research as a preparatory work for design projects. That is something that has to be, again, built into the curricula, because if you just try to approach it and slip it in there, it's not consistent across the courses. They may not have it through beginner level, like first year courses, through fourth year level courses and things like that. And then there were just a handful of people who said they don't actually teach it. And then I asked them how they ideally thought it should be taught. And it really was coming down to research assignments and studio courses, obviously overwhelmingly that, and prep work for design project assignments. And as I did the interviews, I really found that that was the most effective way of teaching, and that was how the courses were being changed, how they were really getting things to be instilled at a freshman level, and then it was built up and usable. That skill was usable by the time they were graduating. So thank you very much for coming out and listening to my thesis explanation. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes?
What was the research question?
What was my research question? That is a really good question, and I had several of them, but my first research question was, how are these skills being taught in this level of education in these particular programs? And I had some questions that ranged from more specifics about that, and also where was, but for the interview specifically, where were people learning their research skills, because they weren't learning them probably from graphic design. So a lot of the people that I interviewed had backgrounds in other areas, or they were using something, information that they were getting outside of that. So I should have included it, but I actually have like this big chart of like where these questions go, because especially when I was creating the interview questions, I kind of broke down my research questions and then made these sort of like write your own story kind of things, like if they say this, then this, if they say this, then this, because it's really hard, it's really difficult to interview somebody, because first of all, I like to go off on tangents. The interviewees were going off on tangents that were really interesting, and they apply, but maybe don't fit into your questions. And then also, what happens when they answer your questions, like through all these things, and then you're like back and you're like, I can't ask that because then I sound like I didn't pay attention to them. So now I have to figure out this. So it was really like one of those design your own story kind of things of like, when they say this, do this. Anything else? Yes?
I'm a little surprised that this day and age there seems to be a resistance to usability testing relative to other performances, especially since so much of graphic design is applied. Do you have a sense that there might be more to it than it's time consuming, or we don't understand how to do it?
I think that there may be that's a good idea. Thank you. I think there's limitations to the questionnaire, and it's something that needs to be explored further. The question was, was there more to the usability testing resistance that appeared in the questionnaire? I think from my discussions, from the interviews that I did, I think a lot of that has to do with those who are teaching design in a theoretical and strict sense of design versus people who are doing things that involve coding and interaction. I think that's part of it, and I think a lot of it is just there's just so much that's required of the coursework for the students. But I think that would be a great area to just study in itself. Like all of these little nuanced areas are their own sort of research areas. Anything else? Yes?
I know this wasn't a focus for your research project, but one that you came across in this research was focusing on mostly undergraduate students. Did you come across any correlations in how these classes or modular programs set you up for success between the undergraduate students and the graduate students? Because when I think about some of the class or income disparities of people who are willing to take graduate level courses for graphic design, for example, if they are not getting access to some of the things that you mentioned, feasibility studies, all of these things that aren't necessarily taught or experienced in undergraduate classes, but they are in graduate classes, are there some disparities, for those who can't afford to take those classes and attaining those jobs and attaining, that those skills and knowledge?
As far as disparity between the education of an undergraduate program versus a graduate program and the accessibility of a graduate program, I think maybe one of the biggest issues would be at the undergraduate level, you don't have enough background in order to support it or access to practice. But even more so, without it becoming commentary on just education in general, I find that when I teach freshmen, and that's just from anecdotal from my own experience, when I teach freshmen, they are not prepared for college level inquiry. They're not, because of the setting of a public school and having to learn toward a test, they don't necessarily know how to think on their own yet and things of that. So we're doing a lot of that in the undergraduate program to begin with. I taught a course for freshmen coming in with, it was called Computers for Artists. And I really kept the focus away from it. I was like, you guys, anybody with a computer access to YouTube can figure out how to do anything on a computer. And let's really focus on what you do before you bring it to a computer. The concepting, the research, and things of that nature. And I really made my course heavy on that, because things that you would think that students had already had before they came in, they don't. And along with that, I think really comes confidence issue, because as an undergraduate, I mean, as a graduate student, when you have to make, you know, claims and try to back them up and sound like an authority and everything, you think, really, there's somebody much more qualified for this than I am, or whatever, when you're doing that. But when you're in an undergraduate program, it's very hard for them to back up a claim, just because they are inexperienced as well, but just to have that confidence and also have the abilities to do it. So I didn't really explore that through this. I narrowed it down to undergraduate studies, because that's where I was teaching, and also because, as you know, whenever you're studying anything, you have to narrow it down pretty far so that you can actually get something done, which is why I was very specific about these 4-year programs. Anyone? Well, thank you. Please enjoy.